Let's start with what Vegas thinks of the Vols and Missouri. A 1.5 to pick them. Let's go back, I guess, a week ago, because nobody's surprised that Tennessee was able to win easily against UConn. So we're not dealing really with any new information. Maybe the disparagement between Tennessee and UConn was a little bit different in your eyes, but it wasn't to me. I didn't really learn that much more about either team after the game because I think Tennessee is so much better. So I thought last week that Tennessee would probably be a 3 or 4 point favorite, if I remember correctly. And were you not a little higher? Or am I misremembering? I'm trying to figure out this 1.5
No,
to
I
pick.
think we were on the same boat that it'd be about 3 to 4 points.
Okay. Well, so are you surprised it's 1.5 to pick them?
No, because in one of the gambling moves I got right, I think Vegas was actually surprised by how well Missouri played Georgia. Missouri was 15.5 point underdogs in that game, and they lost by 9. And quite honestly, if Eli Drinkwitz didn't make the stupid decision to settle for no points at the end of the first half, and a couple other things didn't happen, that's a one possession game. And so I think they
Well,
looked at that.
it was a one possession game late too until the Missouri quarterback just makes the horrendous play of kind of throwing the ball into a crowd of people and it's intercepted by a defensive tackle and just run the other way. But Missouri, up until that point, I'm going to give it to Missouri. You know me, I like to crack on them. I'm not a fan of Missouri, but they played hard with Georgia. And until that interception by a defensive lineman that got it down, I believe, inside the 10, Caleb, I'll give Missouri credit. They were cracking helmets. They were playing hard. They believed they could win despite being down at 6 points, I believe, at the time that I was watching. And that's a tougher football team than it was last year. When we talked about them getting better, kind of thought of them along the lines of maybe figuring some things out. But those guys play to believe, and I give them credit for that.
Yeah, they do. They have they fight hard. Remember at the beginning of the year, I would warn you because I'd said last year they were in about they went 7-6, but they should have won 4 of the games they lost, including the Georgia game last year. And those losses have turned into wins this year because they're significantly better and they're putting up better fights. I mean, coming off a bye, playing Georgia on the road, I think they played very, very well. There's plenty of concern about Georgia that we could talk about that we'll get into also, but yeah, so I think this line is Vegas still thinks Tennessee's better. They're pleasantly surprised about Missouri, but they also think it was close largely because Missouri had the benefit of coming off a bye, and they think it's a lot of what Georgia didn't do more than what Missouri did do. And so that's why I think they still have Tennessee favored. Tennessee's now number 12 in the coaches poll, number 14 in the AP poll. I think they're the highest ranked 2-loss team right now overall. I could be wrong on that, but I think Tennessee is the most. I think Tennessee is the highest ranked 2-loss team. They're kind of flirting with that with maybe Oregon State. It's like them and Oregon State are kind of together. So there's a lot of respect out there for Tennessee right now. Oregon State and Utah. Oregon State and Utah are higher than Tennessee in the AP poll, and Tennessee is the highest ranked of the 2-loss teams in the coaches poll right now. So
We appreciate David Michael saying, Dave, Caleb, OTH, thanks for being the best outlet on Vols content. Lots to talk about. Great seeing Nico. We are winning the East. So Tennessee does get to see a little bit of Nico. I don't know that affects their ranking at all. But as far as being up to 14 in the AP poll, 12 in the coaches poll, I really have no argument either way. I mean, we can nitpick, take one team here and one team there that Tennessee should be ahead of or behind. But to me, they feel like a top, I'm going to say top 12 to 14 team. And that's a team that's on the bubble to make the playoff next year.
yeah, they absolutely do. And honestly, the one I would make a case for, I would argue they should be ahead of Oregon State. But Oregon State did beat Utah. Utah did beat Florida. Florida did beat Tennessee. So maybe that's where they're going with that. But I could see the argument either way with those two. I think you're right. They see Tennessee as a fringe playoff team. And by the way, this is 12 and 14 with 3 weeks to go in November and a lot of games coming up. And should Tennessee win out, I mean, that's a tall order, but it's not impossible. But the way they're playing right now, I think you and I both agree, Dave, This Tennessee team is not the Tennessee team that lost to Florida. It's not even close to the Tennessee team that beat Texas A&M. We never would have thought that team had a shot against Georgia. This one does.
Let me ask you this. Realistic wins out, which isn't really winning out because that would be a loss to Georgia, right? Because they're going to be underdogs to Georgia. So realistic win out, which is a loss to Georgia, which isn't a win out. Where does Tennessee finish now that we're looking at where we're looking, and that's a top 15 program? Where would Tennessee finish? And you know what I'm going to ask you next. It's going to be where would they finish with a win against Georgia? But with a loss to Georgia, which most people would believe would be the case, where does Tennessee finish at the end of the regular season? That would be a win over Missouri and Vanderbilt.
If they lose to Georgia, I think Tennessee finishes 15-ish, right around there in the regular season. Bowl game notwithstanding, I think it's about 15-ish. I don't think they're going to drop too much. It also depends on how they play Georgia. If they go out and lose to Georgia on the final drive, they may actually move up in that. But if they lose to Georgia the way they lost last year, they're going to drop. And I think that's going to be a big deal, particularly since other teams have been playing Georgia tough. If Tennessee doesn't play them tough, it's going to be a really bad look for them. Now, to your other question, if they finish 10-2, David, they finish 10-2, they're going to be in the top 6. They're going to be in the top 6 at the end of the year. And we're all Tennessee fans will be looking at, will be like, gosh, that darn Florida game. That's what'll be in their heads, because if they finish 10-2, that Florida game will be the most costly Florida loss Tennessee ever suffered.
Oh, yes, but just because the Tennessee-Florida series was earlier in the year, so you had room to make up. So, yeah, I'll give you that. But if you looked at it in retrospect, there were teams that lost in that Florida game in the 90s that would have done much more, and they were kind of locked into a corner. Never stick baby in a corner. So I'll agree with you, because you had time to work your way back into the conversation, right?
Yeah, well, that and the reason this one will have turned out to be so much more costly is because those Florida teams in the 90s, we can debate, but they were, I mean, you're talking two teams on par in the same tier with talent. You know what I mean? Like, I think Tennessee was better. You think those Florida teams had a little more talent, but either way, they were in the same tier. They're not in the same tier, these two teams, this year's Tennessee and Florida team. Tennessee is a significant level above Florida in talent. I mean, there's a huge gap between the two schools. So that's why I say this would be the most costly loss, because they lost to a far inferior Florida team where if they finish 10-2, that may have cost them the East, and it will have cost them a shot at the college football playoff. And that's a huge deal.
No, very good point. Okay, a couple of things to get to. The Tennessee football report card grading the Vols in a 59-3 win versus UConn. And I always ask you to do this, if you don't mind, provide a little bit of insight as to how you give these grades, because it's one thing getting an A against Alabama. It's another thing getting an A against, I don't know, UConn.
It is. It's much harder to grade, but the way I look at it is, I heard this one time in sports. In real life, there's one difference between sports and real life, and because they're like football can apply to real life. But here's where there's a big difference, Dave. In real life, you don't get credit for doing what you're supposed to do. Like, you shouldn't get credit for taking care of your kids. You know what I mean? Like, you're supposed to take care of your kids.
This is the Chris Rock bit, but anyway,
right.
Go ahead.
Yes. In sports, you do get credit for doing what you're supposed to do. So if you're playing a bad team and you're supposed to blow them out, and you do blow them out, you should get the credit for that. If that makes sense. So when I'm grading Tennessee with UConn, I'm like, okay, did everybody do what they should have done? And if they do what they should have done, I'll grade them. I'll give them an A, even if I don't know if they would have gotten the A against Alabama. There was nothing more they could have done. You know what I mean? So that led to a lot of great grades. So yeah, it's the in sports, I think some like Phil Jackson was supposed to win all those championships because he had Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, but he still gets credit for winning them.
You're right.
And so that's what my criteria is.
You just don't want to lose one of those to Jordan. That would be almost as newsworthy. I mean, have you ever thought about Jordan just 5-1 instead of 6-0? 6-0 sounds so much more beautiful.